Tonight, we're going to talk about the tiny clay objects that quietly rewrote the entire course of human civilization. And I do mean tiny. Little lumps of dried mud no bigger than a fingernail. Some shaped like cones, some like spheres, some like little discs with a hole punched through the middle. Nothing special to look at. Truly. If you found one in your garden this weekend, you would probably toss it into a flower pot without a second thought and never think about it again. But for thousands of years, in the sun-baked villages of the ancient Near East, these little clay pellets were how humanity remembered things. They were the receipts, the ledgers, the IOUs, the debts, the promises, the whispered agreements between a farmer and his neighbor about 6 sheep that were going to be paid back in the spring. And out of these humble little tokens, sometime around 5,000 years ago, in a mud brick city in what is now southern Iraq, something extraordinary happened. Someone made a mark on a wet piece of clay and, without ever quite realizing what they were doing, invented writing. Just to give you a taste of where this story is going to take us tonight, I want you to picture a few scenes. In the first, we are in the city of Uruk around the year 3200 BC. A weary temple accountant is pressing shapes into the surface of a soft clay tablet by lamplight. He is counting bushels of barley owed to the storehouse of the goddess Inanna. At the very bottom of the tablet, he scratches 2 small signs. And those 2 signs, if we are reading them correctly, are name. Kashim. That name might just be the first personal name in recorded human history. And the first person in history whose name we know isn't a king or a warrior or a priest or a hero. It's a bookkeeper, counting beer rations. I don't know why, but I find that very touching. Now jump forward about 900 years. We are in the Sumerian city of Ur, and a woman in linen robes is standing on a temple platform under a blazing sky. Her name is Enheduanna. She is a high priestess and the daughter of a king, and she has just done something no one has ever done before. She has written a hymn, and at the end of that hymn, she has signed her own name. The first author in all of history, the very first person to say, "I wrote this," was a woman. Isn't that lovely? Now jump forward again to a windswept mountainside in the Sinai Desert, sometime around 1800 BC. Semitic-speaking laborers, sweaty and dust-covered, are chipping turquoise out of the rock for their Egyptian bosses. On the walls of a nearby shrine, one of them scratches a few strange, simplified signs. Not the elegant, elaborate hieroglyphs of the pharaoh. Something rougher. Something quicker. Something a working man could learn in an afternoon. And that little shortcut, invented by some anonymous laborer in the middle of nowhere, will one day become every letter you have ever read. That's just a taste of where this story is heading tonight. And of course, we're going to start from the very beginning, back when there was no writing at all, and work our way slowly and calmly all the way to the letters on your screen. But before we get into it, let me welcome you to the channel. Hello to all the new faces, and hello also to the familiar ones. Wherever you are in the world right now, whether you are curled up under a blanket in the middle of the night, or drifting through a long train ride, or maybe cooking something slowly in the kitchen, I am glad you are here. I would love to know where you are listening from tonight. Drop it in the comments. And I would especially love to hear from you if you have ever tried to learn one of these old scripts. Cuneiform, hieroglyphs, Phoenician, any of them. I know a few of you are hobbyist paleographers out there. Don't be shy. And of course, as always, I want to say a heartfelt thank you to the patrons, the members, the people who donate, and everyone who visits the merch store. You are the reason this channel runs completely ad-free. No mid-roll interruptions, no 10 different ads shouting at you every 8 minutes trying to sell you a mattress. Just a nice long story, told from beginning to end in a calm voice. If you would like to become part of that lovely little club, the links you need are in the pinned comment, the video description, and the channel description. Everything is right there for you. All right. With that out of the way, let's settle in. To understand where writing came from, we have to go all the way back to a time before anyone was writing anything at all. And that time is, well, it's enormous. Really enormous. For roughly 200,000 years, our species, Homo sapiens, walked this earth without a single written word. Not one. Everything, and I mean everything, was carried in the memory. Every song, every myth, every recipe, every warning, every love story, every family tree, every argument about who owned what. All of it lived in the mouths of the storytellers, and in the ears of the listeners. And when a person died, whatever they knew that no one else knew died with them. Just imagine it. 200,000 years of the human story, and every single generation had to begin almost from scratch. Everything the ancestors had figured out, if it wasn't remembered, was simply lost. Now, of course, humans are inventive creatures, so they came up with ways to help their memories along. They painted animals on the walls of caves in what is now France and Spain. They carved little tally marks into bones. There is a very famous piece of baboon bone from what is now Eswatini called the Lebombo bone, which is roughly 40,000 years old and has 29 little notches cut into it. Nobody knows for absolutely certain what those notches meant. Maybe it was a lunar calendar. Maybe it was a count of something else entirely HM. But whatever it was, it is one of the earliest hints we have of a very human urge. The urge to keep score. The urge to record. The urge to say, I want to remember this, and I do not trust my head to do it alone. Now let's fast forward to the end of the last ice age, around 10,000 BC. The great glaciers are retreating. The climate is warming. And in a strip of land curling from the Nile up through the Levant and down through Mesopotamia into the mountains of western Iran, a region we now rather romantically call the Fertile Crescent, human beings begin to do something they have never done before. They begin to farm. They stop wandering after herds. They plant seeds. They build permanent houses. They domesticate goats and sheep and pigs and cattle. And with agriculture comes a whole new set of problems that hunter-gatherers never really had to worry about. Because now, suddenly, you own things. You own a plot of wheat. You own a stockpile of grain. You own 6 goats and a bag of lentils and half a share of your neighbor's ox. And your neighbor owes you 3 jars of oil from harvest last year. And the temple owes you a favor because you loaned them barley in the drought. And your cousin is holding on to some of your sheep for the winter. But is he going to give them all back come spring? All of them? Are you sure? How do you keep track of any of it? You know what I mean. It's a mess. Around 9000 BC, someone in the ancient Near East came up with a very clever answer. They took a lump of soft clay and shaped it into a little geometric form. A small cone, maybe, to represent 1 measure of grain, a sphere for a larger measure, a disc with lines on it for a certain number of sheep, a cylinder for jars of oil. These little clay tokens, no bigger than a die, were basically the world's first accounting system, and the beauty of them was their simplicity. If you owed your neighbor 5 measures of grain, you handed them 5 cones. If a farmer delivered 10 sheep to the temple, someone dropped 10 discs into a jar in the storeroom. The tokens were the receipt. They were the memory. They stood in for the goods themselves. And best of all, they did not require you to remember anything. The tokens remembered for you. For about 5,000 years, this quiet little system worked pretty well. Little tokens moved from hand to hand across the Near East, from small farming villages to the first walled towns. Archaeologists have found them by the thousands at sites all across the region, from Iran to Turkey to Syria. Different shapes for different goods, some plain, some decorated with little pressed marks or scratches to indicate quality or type. A tiny, quiet economy of clay, humming away in the background of human life for longer than all of recorded history put together. But then, around 4000 BC, something began to change. The Near East was becoming more complicated. Villages were becoming towns, and towns were becoming cities. And in southern Mesopotamia, in the marshy floodplain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, one city in particular was ballooning to a size that had never been seen anywhere on Earth. Its name was Uruk. Uruk, at its peak, may have held 40,000 people or more. That does not sound like a lot today. Your local shopping mall on a Saturday might have that many. But 5,000 years ago, 40,000 people all living together, all inside the same set of walls, was an almost unimaginable concentration of humanity. And with all those people came a bureaucracy the world had never seen before. Great temples with vast stores of grain, networks of canals to manage, herds of animals belonging to the priesthood, traders coming and going with copper and lapis lazuli and cedar from far distant lands, workers to pay, rations to distribute, debts to track, contracts to enforce. The old system of loose little tokens jangling around in a bag was simply not going to cut it anymore. It was becoming too easy to lose track, too easy to cheat. Too easy for someone to shake the bag and pretend there had been fewer cones in there yesterday than there really had been. And so, in Uruk, the accountants came up with a new idea. They began to seal groups of tokens inside hollow clay balls about the size of a tennis ball. A merchant could load, say, 7 cones and 3 discs into a soft clay envelope, close it up, and both parties could press their personal seals into the outside so that no one could tamper with it later. If a dispute arose weeks or months down the line, you simply smashed the ball open, counted the tokens, and settled the argument right there. This was clever. This was progress. But it also created a small new problem. Once the ball was sealed, you could no longer actually see what was inside, which sort of defeated the whole purpose of using tokens in the first place if you had to smash the entire thing open every time you wanted to check the balance. So the accountants of Uruk added one more little refinement. Before sealing the ball, they would press each token gently into the soft clay of the outer surface, leaving a little impression. A cone left a wedge-shaped mark. A disc left a round mark. That way, before you ever broke the ball open, you could look at the outside and count up the shapes and know what was inside without ever disturbing the seal. It seems like such a small thing, doesn't it? A minor little bureaucratic tweak. But this little tweak is standing right on the edge of the most important cognitive leap in the entire history of the human species. Because somewhere in Uruk, somewhere in one of those dusty temple offices 5,000 years ago, some anonymous accountant was staring at the marks on the outside of a clay ball. And he had a thought so simple and yet so revolutionary that it changed the world forever. If the mark on the outside means the same thing as the token on the inside, then why do I need the tokens at all? That thought, or something very much like it, is the single most important idea in the entire history of human communication. And we will never know the name of the person who had it. We will never know if they were a man or a woman, young or old, a senior scribe or some apprentice sweeping the floor. We do not know if they announced their discovery to a room full of colleagues who nodded politely, or if they wandered home that evening muttering to themselves about clay balls, wondering if they had gone slightly mad. All we have is the result. The archaeological record simply shows us that at a certain moment in Uruk, around 3200 BC, the hollow clay balls stopped being made. The tokens more or less disappeared from the accounting offices. And in their place, quietly and almost without fanfare, we get something new. A flat little pillow of clay, a tablet. The very first tablets are honestly a bit awkward looking. They are small, roughly rectangular, sometimes almost round. Someone has smoothed one side flat and pressed shapes into that flat side with the end of a reed or a piece of bone. The shapes are still recognizable as the old token forms. A little wedge, meaning grain. A circle, meaning sheep. A cross inside a circle, meaning something else. The old vocabulary of the token system, but now flattened out and laid down in neat little rows on a single surface. Instead of carrying around a bag of clay pieces, an accountant could carry a tablet the size of a large biscuit and hold an entire month's worth of transactions right there in his hand. But there was still one small problem, and it is a problem that the human mind had to solve before writing could truly become writing. Because a mark that means grain is a lovely thing, but it does not tell you very much on its own. If I press 5 little wedges into a piece of clay, I have told you something about grain and something about the number 5. But I have not told you whose grain it is, or where it came from, or where it is going, or when, or why. And in a city of 40,000 people with a huge temple economy, those questions matter an enormous amount. Whose grain? Grain from whom? Grain for what? So the scribes of Uruk began, very quickly, to add new signs to their repertoire. Signs that did not stand for goods but for people, places, actions, ideas. And here is where things get really beautiful, because these new signs were not just pressed abstract shapes anymore. These new signs were tiny pictures, little drawings scratched into the clay with the sharp end of a reed. A drawing of a human head, seen from the side, meant a person, or perhaps just the word head. A drawing of a bowl meant food, or a ration, or the act of eating. A drawing of a foot meant to walk, or to go, or to carry. A drawing of a bull's head meant a bull. A drawing of a stalk of barley meant barley. A drawing of a fish meant, well, fish, obviously. These early little drawings are what scholars now call proto-cuneiform. And a lovely thing about them is that when you sit down with a photograph of an ancient tablet from Uruk and someone shows you what the signs originally represented, you can very often see it. There it is. A head, a hand, a jar. It's the ancient world speaking to you in tiny pictures, 5,000 years after the person who scratched them onto the clay went home for the evening and closed their door behind them. Now, what were these very first writers of the very first tablets writing about? Great heroes, beautiful gods, legendary battles, the founding of cities, poems, love songs, curses on their enemies? No, absolutely not. The first tablets of Uruk are, and I really cannot emphasize this enough, extraordinarily boring, just wonderfully, gloriously boring. They are receipts, they are ledgers, they are inventories. They are records of how many jars of beer were handed out to the temple workers this week, and how many sacks of barley are stored in the granary, and how many goats were delivered by such and such a herdsman, and how much wool was collected from the temple flocks. There is nothing in them about the gods, or the king, or the meaning of life. There is nothing about anyone's mother-in-law, or how their day was going. Just numbers and goods and quantities and dates. And that, when you sit back and think about it for a moment, is actually really quite marvelous, because it tells us something rather profound about the origins of writing itself. Writing was not invented by poets. It was not invented by priests seeking to record divine mysteries. It was not invented by kings wanting to boast about their conquests. Writing was invented by accountants. Ordinary, hard-working, slightly tired accountants trying to remember how many sheep somebody owed the temple. The most important invention in the history of human thought was born, essentially, as a way to make sure that nobody cheated on their barley taxes. I don't know why I find that so wonderful, but I do. There is something so deeply, endearingly human about it. We did not invent writing to speak with the gods. We invented writing to argue about who owed whom a jug of beer. And you know what? That's fine. That's honest. That's us. Now, among the tens of thousands of these clay tablets that have been dug up from the ruins of Uruk and its sister cities, there is one small tablet that has become quietly famous. It is not much to look at. It is a small, worn piece of baked clay, roughly the size of your palm. It records, in the strict minimalist style of the early accountants, a transaction concerning barley. About 29,866 measures of barley, to be exact, received over the course of 37 months. And at the bottom of that tablet, quite unusually, someone has signed their name. Two little signs. Read together, they seem to spell out a word. And that word, as best as scholars can reconstruct it, appears to be Kushim. Kushim. Now, we do not know very much about Kushim. We do not know if Kushim was a man or a woman. We do not know if Kushim had children. We do not know what Kushim looked like, what Kushim thought about, what Kushim dreamed of at night. We do not know if the word Kushim is even really a personal name at all. Some scholars think it might be a job title, like the granary manager, rather than the name of an individual person. But most scholars now believe that, yes, this is a name. A specific, actual name of a specific, actual person who lived and breathed and walked around Uruk more than 5,000 years ago. And if that is true, then Kushim is the first person in the entire history of humanity whose name we know. Not a pharaoh, not a warrior, not a hero, a middle management accountant, keeping the books at what appears to have been a large brewery. Yes, a brewery. Because the transactions on Kushim's tablets often involve barley and malt, and well, the ingredients of beer. So the very first human being whose name has come down to us across the centuries appears to have spent his working life counting sacks of grain destined to be turned into beer for the workers and priests of Uruk. There is a lovely little thought to take with you into the evening. And when you look at Kushim's little signature at the bottom of that dry, dusty barley ledger, you are looking, in a very real sense, at the birth of individual identity in the written record. Before Kushim, everyone is anonymous. Every farmer, every priest, every mother, every child, every soldier, every king. Not one of them left behind a name that has survived. But at some point, in some small room in Uruk, this one particular accountant leaned over a wet tablet, and after finishing his columns of barley figures, added 2 extra marks. His own. And in doing so, he stepped out of the great anonymous river of humanity and became, forever, a specific person. Kashim, the accountant, which is, I think, a lovely little thing to have accomplished in one lifetime, even if you did not realize you were accomplishing it at the time. Now, over the next few centuries after Kashim, the writing system of Uruk continued to develop, and it developed in a very particular direction, driven by a very particular practical problem. You see, the early scribes were scratching their little pictures onto the wet clay with the sharp point of a reed, and that is a fine way to draw a picture, but it is a slow way to draw a picture. And drawing curved lines in wet clay tends to push up little ridges of mud on either side of your stroke, which then dry hard and make the tablet difficult to read later. Try drawing a nice little fish shape in soft clay sometime with a sharp stick. It is not the easiest thing in the world. So the scribes of Mesopotamia began, gradually, to abandon the sharp point of the reed and to use instead the blunt corner end. And when you press the blunt corner of a cut reed straight down into wet clay, you do not get a curved line at all. You get a small, clean, triangular wedge, just a single wedge. And that turns out to be a very much faster way to write. Slower to draw a fish, mind you, but much faster to build up a whole sign out of standardized little wedges arranged in patterns. So the little pictures began to disintegrate, one by one. The fish stopped being an actual fish and became a pattern of wedges that used to be a fish. The head stopped being a head. The stalk of barley stopped being a stalk of barley. Everything melted over a period of about 500 years into an abstract dance of little triangular impressions marching across the surface of the tablet. And that new script, made entirely out of these tiny wedge-shaped impressions, is what we today call cuneiform. From the Latin word cuneus, which just means wedge writing. A writing system entirely built out of little triangular pokes into soft clay. And cuneiform would go on to become one of the most successful writing systems in the entire history of the human species. It would be used, adapted, borrowed, and reworked by culture after culture for over 3,000 years. Longer, in fact, than our own alphabet has yet existed. Cuneiform would go on to become one of the most successful writing systems in the entire history of the human species. Used for over 3,000 years, spreading across an area from the Mediterranean coast all the way to the mountains of Iran. Adapted by the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Hittites, the Elamites, the Persians, and heavens knows how many others. It became the international language of diplomacy in the Bronze Age. Great kings wrote to other great kings in cuneiform on tablets sealed in clay envelopes and carried across deserts by trusted messengers. Trade contracts were sealed in cuneiform. Marriage agreements were sealed in cuneiform. Prayers, laws, medical recipes, astronomical observations, dream interpretations, love poems, and yes, still, endless accounts of barley and beer and sheep, all recorded in cuneiform on tablet after tablet after tablet. And here is a lovely little fact for you to hold on to, because clay tablets, once they are baked, either intentionally in a kiln or accidentally in a house fire, become essentially indestructible. They do not rot like papyrus. They do not crumble like paper. They do not fade like ink. They just sit there in the dirt for thousands and thousands of years, patiently waiting for someone to come along and dig them up. So while we have lost, quite tragically, almost all of the writings of ancient Greece and Rome that were originally pennied on papyrus and parchment, we have found, and continue to find, literally millions of cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia. Millions. Whole libraries of them. Whole archives. Some archaeologists estimate that there may still be as many as 2 million cuneiform tablets sitting untouched in museum basements around the world, waiting for someone to have the time and the training to actually read what they say. Just imagine it. 2 million voices from 5,000 years ago, still waiting, still patient, still holding on to whatever it was they had to say, until someone finally opens the box and lets them speak. Now back in Uruk itself, in the centuries after Kashim laid down his reed and went home for the last time, the writing system spread outward from the temple accountants into other parts of society. Scribal schools began to appear. Little dusty rooms where boys, and I do mean boys almost exclusively at first, sat cross-legged on the floor for years and years, practicing their signs on scrap tablets. We have found many of these practice tablets, and they are one of the most touching things in all of archaeology. Little wobbly attempts at the standard signs, repetitive lines of the same word written over and over, occasional teachers' corrections pressed into the margins, small mistakes crossed out, small triumphs. And on the back of a few of these practice tablets, we sometimes find what look suspiciously like doodles, small drawings of animals, little scratched jokes. In one case, a bored student appears to have written out a long, elaborate complaint about how his teacher beat him for making mistakes, and how his father had to bring the teacher an extra gift so he would stop being so harsh with the boy. Which, honestly, is such a wonderfully universal complaint that you could translate it into English right now and read it aloud in any modern classroom, and every student in the room would nod in weary recognition. Some things never change, no matter how many thousands of years go by. Boys hate school. Teachers can be harsh. Parents have to smooth things over. That is just the nature of the human condition, apparently. The scribes who graduated from these schools became, over time, an enormously powerful class of professionals, because writing, in the ancient world, was not a general skill that ordinary people picked up. Cuneiform had, at its height, something like 600 different signs, and each sign could carry multiple meanings depending on context. Some signs stood for whole words, some signs stood for syllables, some signs stood for the general category of a word, sort of like a little label telling you what type of thing was coming next. It took 10 to 15 years of full-time study to become a proficient scribe, which meant that the ability to read and write in ancient Mesopotamia was concentrated in the hands of a tiny, tiny fraction of the population. Maybe 1%, maybe less. Everyone else was completely illiterate and depended, for every letter they sent, and every contract they signed, and every complaint they lodged, on this small elite class of trained specialists. And this is going to be a theme throughout the story tonight, so keep it in the back of your mind. For most of history, writing has been a kind of secret, a guarded skill, a privilege, something that gave power to those who possessed it and left everyone else out in the cold, dependent on the goodwill of the scribes to translate their spoken words into permanent form. It will take us until much, much later in our story before writing becomes something that ordinary human beings can do for themselves. Right now, in ancient Uruk, we are still at the very beginning of that long, long journey. But while all of this was happening in Mesopotamia, something else was happening several hundred miles to the west, along a great river called the Nile. Because Mesopotamia is not the only place where writing appeared in the ancient world, and this is something that scholars still argue about, sometimes rather fiercely. Was writing invented only once, in Uruk, and then the idea spread outward to inspire other cultures? Or was it invented independently in several different places at roughly the same time, with different peoples arriving at the same solution to the same fundamental problem? The truth, honestly, is that we do not entirely know. But what we do know is that at almost the exact same moment that the accountants of Uruk were pressing their little wedges into clay, a completely different writing system was blossoming into existence in Egypt: Egyptian hieroglyphs. Now, hieroglyphs are famous. They are probably the most instantly recognizable writing system in all of human history. Even someone who has never studied a single day of Egyptology can look at a wall of hieroglyphs and know, immediately, what civilization they are looking at. Those little birds and snakes and eyes and hands and reeds and jars, laid out in neat, orderly columns down the sides of great stone temples and the interiors of royal tombs. It is such a distinctive visual language that it has come to stand, in the popular imagination, for the entire ancient world. But here is the thing that most people do not realize about hieroglyphs, and it is a rather important thing. Hieroglyphs are not, and never really were, a system for writing down the everyday language of ordinary Egyptians. Hieroglyphs were, from the very beginning, a monumental script, a ceremonial script, a script designed for permanence, for temple walls, for royal tombs, for the labels on statues of the gods. Every hieroglyph was individually carved, sometimes painted, sometimes both. It was slow, it was expensive, it was beautiful, and it was reserved for messages that were meant to last forever. For the everyday business of writing letters and keeping accounts and recording contracts and jotting down notes, the ancient Egyptians developed, very quickly, a much simpler and faster script that we now call hieratic. Hieratic is basically what happens when you take hieroglyphs and try to write them quickly with a reed brush and ink on a sheet of papyrus. The little pictures become squiggles. The birds become swooshes. The whole system becomes a flowing, cursive shorthand that a trained scribe could dash off at speed. Later, an even faster version called demotic would develop for really quick, everyday writing. So the ancient Egyptians actually had, essentially, three different scripts running side by side. Hieroglyphs for the eternal messages carved in stone, hieratic for the everyday papers of daily life, and later, demotic for the really quick and dirty stuff, all of them representing the same underlying language, just adapted to different situations. Sort of like how you might print carefully when you are filling out a formal document, but scribble in cursive when you are jotting down a shopping list. Same language, same words, different physical realization on the page. Now, where did Egyptian writing come from? And this is where the arguments really get going. Because Egyptian writing appears in the archaeological record at almost exactly the same moment as Mesopotamian writing does. Some scholars argue that the idea of writing traveled from Mesopotamia to Egypt via trade routes, and that the Egyptians, having heard that the people to their east had come up with this clever new system, decided to invent their own version of it in their own visual style. Other scholars argue that the two systems are so different in structure and in appearance that they must have been invented completely independently, and that it is just a coincidence, or perhaps a reflection of the general cultural ferment of the late 4th millennium BC, that they show up at more or less the same time. Personally, I lean toward the view that the Egyptians probably heard rumors of what the Mesopotamians were doing and thought, right, we can do that too, and better. But the system they created was so distinctively their own, so wonderfully Egyptian in every aesthetic detail, that it can only really be called an independent invention in spirit, even if not in inspiration. It is a bit like how many different peoples independently invented pottery, or the bow and arrow, or the boat. Once one culture shows another that something is possible, the second culture very often figures out its own way to do it. And what a system it was, this Egyptian writing. Hieroglyphs, at their most developed, had about 700 signs. Some of them stood for whole words. Some of them stood for sounds, individual consonants or combinations of consonants. Some of them stood for categories of meaning, little labels called determinatives that helped the reader figure out what type of word was being spelled out. So a hieroglyphic text was actually a rather sophisticated mixture of pictographic writing, phonetic writing, and semantic categorization, all layered on top of each other in the same string of signs. Reading it fluently required years and years and years of dedicated training. Egyptian scribes were, if anything, an even more privileged and jealously guarded elite than their Mesopotamian counterparts, and they knew it. There is a wonderful ancient Egyptian text called the Satire of the Trades, written by a father to his son who was heading off to scribal school, and the whole text is basically an extended lecture about how every single other job in Egyptian society is miserable and awful, and how being a scribe is the only path to a comfortable life. The father goes through profession after profession, describing in vivid detail how terrible each one is. The metalworker's fingers are like crocodile skin from the heat. The barber wanders the streets looking for work until his arms grow weak. The reed cutter is bitten by mosquitoes and sandflies until he is half dead. The washerman's hands are ruined by lie. Only the scribe, the father insists. Only the scribe sits comfortably in the shade, well-fed, well-clothed, respected by all, and never has to lift anything heavier than a reed brush. Only the scribe, the father insists. Only the scribe sits comfortably in the shade, well-fed, well-clothed, respected by all, and never has to lift anything heavier than a reed brush. And you can just picture the boy rolling his eyes at all this, can't you? Yes, father, I know, father. I've heard this speech 17 times already, father. But the underlying point is well taken. In ancient Egypt, learning to read and write was quite literally the ticket to a completely different life. It was the difference between working in the mud from dawn to dusk and sitting in a cool temple office, pushing papers around and taking a nice long lunch, which, honestly, is a calculation that has not changed all that much in 5,000 years. Now, hieroglyphs are worth pausing on for a moment because they are such a beautiful example of how early writing systems worked. And to give you a sense of what they were actually doing, let's take a single example. The Egyptian word for house. In spoken Egyptian, this word was pronounced something like per, and the hieroglyph for house is exactly what you would expect. A little rectangle with a gap on one side to represent the doorway, just a simple, schematic floor plan of a house, viewed from above. When you see that sign in a text, one of the things it might mean is, well, house. But here is where it gets clever. The little house sign could also, in certain contexts, simply stand for the sound, per, regardless of what the actual word was. So if you needed to write a word that started with the sounds, per, you could use the house sign to represent those sounds, even if the word had nothing whatsoever to do with houses. This is called the rebus principle, and it is one of the most crucial cognitive leaps in the entire development of writing. It is the moment when signs stop being purely tied to their meanings and start being available as pure sounds, ready to be reassembled into any word you like. Think of it like a puzzle in an English language children's book. You draw a picture of an eye, then a picture of a saw, then a picture of a bee. And what does that spell? It spells, I saw a bee. The pictures have stopped meaning I and saw and bee. They are now standing for the pure sounds of English, ready to be strung together to make any sentence you want. The Egyptians were doing this 5,000 years ago, and the Mesopotamians were doing something very similar with their cuneiform signs. Both cultures had figured out that the real power of writing is unlocked not when signs stand for things, but when signs stand for sounds. Because once you have signs for sounds, you can write absolutely anything that a human being can say. And this is a good moment for me to point something out that is going to become very important later in our story. Because if you look carefully at Egyptian hieroglyphs, you will notice that a small number of them are behaving almost like an alphabet. Not quite, but almost. The Egyptians had, tucked away inside their enormous system of 700 signs, a smaller set of about 24 signs that each stood for a single consonant sound. One sign for a B sound, one sign for a P sound, one sign for a K sound, and so on. Now, the Egyptians never really used these signs on their own as a standalone alphabet. They always mixed them in with the hundreds of other signs, using them alongside word signs and determinatives in complex combinations. But those 24 little uniconsonantal signs, as scholars call them, were sitting there, quietly, inside the hieroglyphic system for over 1,000 years, just waiting for somebody to notice them, just waiting for somebody to say, hang on a moment, why don't we just use those? But that is a story for later. For now, let's leave Egypt for a bit and swing back over to Mesopotamia because we have a very important person to meet. The year is around 2300 BC. We are now roughly 900 years after Kushum scratched his name onto that beer ledger in Uruk. Writing has spread across Mesopotamia and become an established, mature, fully functional technology. The city of Uruk is still going strong, but it is no longer the only game in town. A whole constellation of Sumerian city-states now dots the plain between the Tigris and the Euphrates. Lagash, Nippur, Kish, Umma, Eridu. Each with its own king, its own patron god, its own temple economy, its own scribal schools. And in this whole busy Sumerian world, at this particular moment, a new power is rising. A man named Sargon, from the city of Akkad somewhere to the north, has conquered pretty much everything. He's the first person in recorded history to build what we would recognize as an empire. He rules from the Persian Gulf up to the Mediterranean coast. He has crushed his rivals, absorbed their cities, and installed his own governors in every corner of his vast new domain. And to hold this whole enormous thing together, Sargon needs loyal, capable, powerful officials in every major city. So he appoints his own daughter to one of the most important religious posts in all of Sumer. He makes her the high priestess of the moon god Nana at the great temple in the city of Ur. Her name is Enheduanna, and she is about to change history. Now, we know quite a lot about Enheduanna, considering how long ago she lived. We know what she looked like, more or less, Because a wonderful limestone disc was discovered by archaeologists in the ruins of the temple at Ur, and on one side of that disc is carved an image of her, standing tall in her priestly robes, overseeing a religious ceremony. She has a serious face, a tall headdress, long flowing garments. She looks every inch the powerful woman that she was. On the other side of the disc is an inscription giving her name and her titles. Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon, high priestess of Nanna at Ur. But that is not what makes Enheduanna famous today. What makes Enheduanna famous today is that she wrote things. Really beautiful, really personal, really extraordinary things. And at the end of what she wrote, she signed her name. And that makes her, as far as we can tell, the first named author in the entire history of human literature. Let me say that again, because it is worth savoring. The first named author in all of history was a woman, a Sumerian priestess writing in cuneiform on clay tablets more than 4,300 years ago, before Homer, before the writers of the Hebrew Bible, before Confucius, before the Buddha, before Sappho, before every single author whose name you might associate with the ancient world. There was Enheduanna, in her temple at Ur, dictating her hymns to a scribe or perhaps writing them herself on the clay, and putting her name at the end so that the world would know who had made them. What did she write? She wrote hymns to the gods. Long, elaborate, deeply personal hymns to the goddess Inanna in particular, who was the great Sumerian goddess of love and war and the morning star. And her hymns are not the formulaic, distant, ceremonial things that you might expect. They are passionate, they are furious, they are frightened, they are hopeful, they are full of the actual voice of an actual woman who was living an actual life in a moment of enormous political turmoil. Because Enheduanna's father Sargon eventually died, and the empire he had built began to shudder and shake. Rebellions broke out across Sumer, and Enheduanna herself, this powerful priestess installed by the conqueror, became a target. In one of her most famous hymns, called The Exaltation of Inanna, she describes how a local rebel leader named Lugalan rose up against Sargon's dynasty and drove Enheduanna out of her temple. She writes about being forced to flee. She writes about wandering in exile. She writes about her offerings being defiled. She writes about the humiliation of being reduced from high priestess to homeless refugee. And she pours out her heart to Inanna, begging the goddess to intervene, to restore her, to punish her enemies, to notice her suffering. There is a passage where she writes, and I am paraphrasing here rather than quoting because the original is much better in Sumerian than in any English translation. But she essentially says, "My mouth is stripped of its praise, my body is dust, my voice is broken." She writes about hiding in the shadows like a lizard, about being unable to sleep, about the salt taste of her own tears. It is one of the earliest surviving pieces of confessional writing in the entire history of literature. 4,300 years ago, a woman was sitting down and writing about her own emotions, her own fear, her own hope, her own outrage at what had been done to her. And she was signing her name to it so that we would know all these millennia later that these were her words, not the temple's words, not the king's words, not the god's words, her words. Enheduanna, as far as we know, was eventually restored to her position, or at least survived long enough to write about it, and her hymns became something of a classic in the Sumerian and Akkadian world. Scribal students were copying and recopying her work for well over 500 years after her death, which means that ancient Mesopotamian schoolchildren were memorizing the poetry of Enheduanna the way European schoolchildren once memorized the poetry of Homer or Virgil. She was a canonical author, respected, studied, quoted. And then, gradually, as the Sumerian and Akkadian languages themselves fell out of use and cuneiform was eventually forgotten, she vanished from human memory entirely. For nearly 2,000 years, no one on earth knew that Enheduanna had ever existed. Her tablets sat under the sand at Ur, waiting patiently as the centuries rolled by. And it was only in the early 20th century, when archaeologists began systematically excavating the ruins of Sumerian cities, and when scholars finally learned how to read cuneiform again, that Enheduanna's name and her poetry came slowly, piece by piece, back into the light. Today she is finally, at long last, beginning to receive the recognition she deserves. There are exhibitions about her. There are books being written about her. There are university courses studying her work. She is, quietly, taking her rightful place at the very beginning of the enormous library of human literature, where she has always belonged. And the reason all of this matters for our story tonight is that Enheduanna represents a huge shift in what writing was being used for. Because remember, writing began as accounting. It began as barley and beer and sheep and receipts. It began with people like Cusham tallying up rations and signing off on shipments. But by the time we get to Enheduanna, writing has grown up. It has become something bigger than a bookkeeping tool. By the time we get to Enheduanna, writing has grown up. It has become something bigger than a bookkeeping tool. It has become a way to record poetry, to record prayer, to record the interior life of a single human being, to reach across the centuries and speak directly to strangers who have not yet been born. Cusham invented literacy as a means of tracking beer. Enheduanna, 900 years later, transformed that same technology into a way of speaking to eternity. And in between those two figures, the whole idea of what writing could do, of what writing was for, was quietly rewritten from the ground up. From Enheduanna onward, the great literary traditions of Mesopotamia begin to take shape. Somewhere in the centuries after her, though probably drawing on much older oral tales, someone wrote down the Epic of Gilgamesh, the world's first great story. A king who is two-thirds god and one-third man, who befriends a wild man from the wilderness, who fights monsters, who watches his best friend die, and who then sets out on a desperate, doomed journey to find the secret of eternal life. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains a flood story that is unmistakably related to the flood story in the book of Genesis. It contains meditations on friendship, on grief, on the fear of death, on the acceptance of mortality that would not feel out of place in a novel written yesterday. And all of it was preserved for us, in cuneiform, on tablets of baked clay, for 4,000 years, until archaeologists dug them up out of the sands of Nineveh in the 19th century and had to painstakingly puzzle out what the strange wedge marks meant. There is a particular tablet of Gilgamesh, Tablet 11, the one with the flood story on it, that has a rather wonderful history. It was found in the ruined library of an Assyrian king named Ashurbanipal, who reigned in the 7th century BC, and who deliberately collected copies of every important text he could get his hands on. His scribes traveled across the empire, tracking down old tablets and making faithful copies for the royal library at Nineveh. When that city was destroyed in 612 BC, the library was buried in the wreckage, and the tablets sat there under the rubble for well over 2,000 years. In the 1870s, a self-taught British scholar named George Smith was going through a pile of these tablets at the British Museum when he noticed, on one of them, a passage that described a great flood, a boat, animals, a bird sent out to look for land. Smith realized what he was looking at, and according to the perhaps slightly embellished story, became so excited that he began tearing off his clothes and running around the museum in a state of high emotion. Which, if true, must have been quite a scene for the other Victorian scholars quietly working at their desks. But this is what old writing does to people sometimes. It reaches out of the past and grabs hold of us. Because when you are looking at the actual words that an actual human being scratched into an actual piece of clay 4,000 years ago, and those words are still there, still legible, still speaking, there is something almost supernatural about it. A little voice whispering across the centuries, and we are the ones who finally get to hear it, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let's rewind a bit and pick up the other thread of our story. Because while all of this literary flowering was happening in Mesopotamia, and while Egyptian hieroglyphs were being carved onto the walls of grand temples along the Nile, something rather remarkable was quietly beginning to stir in a place that nobody would have expected. A dusty, hot, God-forsaken corner of the ancient world where nothing much was supposed to happen. The Sinai Peninsula, and more specifically, the turquoise mines in the Sinai Peninsula, because it is here, in the middle of nowhere, worked by people whose names have almost entirely been lost, that the story of the alphabet begins. Now, to set the scene. The year is somewhere around 1800 BC. We are now roughly 1400 years after Cusham and about 500 years after Enheduanna. The Egyptian civilization has been humming along for the better part of a millennium and a half. The Great Pyramids at Giza are already ancient monuments even to the Egyptians of this era. The pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom rule from their capital, and they need a great deal of luxury goods to maintain their court. One of the things they need is turquoise. Beautiful, rich, sea blue turquoise, prized for jewelry, prized for religious objects, prized simply for being lovely to look at. And turquoise, unfortunately, does not exist in Egypt itself, but it does exist in reasonably good quantities up in the harsh mountains of the Sinai Peninsula. So every year, the pharaoh sends expeditions across the desert to a place called Serabit el Khadim, where a mine has been operating for centuries, chipping the precious stone out of the rock. But the Egyptians do not do the actual mining themselves. Oh no, that kind of work is far too dangerous, too dirty, too physically miserable for a well-bred Egyptian to lower himself to. So the Egyptians hire, or perhaps in some cases coerce, laborers from the neighboring lands. Specifically, they bring in workers from Canaan, the region to the northeast of Egypt that we would now think of as Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and western Syria. These Canaanite workers speak a Semitic language related to what would later become Hebrew, Phoenician, Aramaic, and Arabic. They are essentially the migrant labor force of the Bronze Age Egyptian economy. They come to the mines, they work for a season or two under the blazing sun, they earn some copper or grain or whatever they are being paid, and then they go home again. Or in many cases, they die in the mines and are buried there and never go home at all. Now, these Canaanite workers spend their days in the presence of Egyptian overseers who can read and write. They see hieroglyphs everywhere. There is a small shrine near the mines dedicated to the goddess Hathor, and its walls are covered with formal Egyptian inscriptions. There are ostraka, little pottery fragments, with Egyptian writing on them all over the site. The workers, illiterate themselves, must have watched with a mixture of curiosity and perhaps envy as their bosses used these strange little pictures to send messages back and forth to Egypt. And at some point, in the middle of all this, a truly remarkable thing happened. One or more of these Canaanite workers, or perhaps a slightly more educated overseer among them, had an idea. Actually, they had two ideas, working together, which combined into perhaps the single greatest cognitive shortcut in the history of human writing. The first idea was this. Look at all those hieroglyphs. There are hundreds of them, but most of them are far too complicated for someone like me to bother learning. However, there are those little uniconsonantal signs that the Egyptian scribes sometimes use, the ones that each stand for a single consonant sound. What if we just used those? What if we ignored all the other hundreds of signs, all the word signs and determinatives and everything else, and just kept the sound signs? Then we would have, what, maybe 24 signs, each standing for a single sound. We could learn all of those in a week. We could teach our children in a month. Anyone could do it. It would be writing, but stripped down, writing for the workers. That was the first idea. But there was a second idea, tangled up with the first. And this second idea is what gives the alphabet its particular flavor, its particular look, its particular character that has echoed down through every letter you have ever read. The second idea was called the acrophonic principle, which sounds like a horribly complicated bit of jargon, but is actually beautifully simple once you understand it. The acrophonic principle just means this. If you want to make a sign for a particular sound, pick a word that starts with that sound, and then draw a picture of that word, and let the picture stand for the first sound of its name. So if you want to make a sign for the sound B, pick a word in your language that begins with B, and draw a little picture of that thing. In Canaanite, the word for house was bait. So the sign for B became a little picture of a house, a simple little rectangle, maybe with a doorway. House picture no longer meant house. It meant the sound B, and if you want to make a sign for the sound M, pick a Canaanite word that starts with M. How about mayim, the word for water? Draw a little wavy line like ripples on the surface of a pond. That wavy line no longer means water. It means the sound M for the sound N. You take the word Nahash, meaning snake. Draw a squiggly serpent. It now means N for K. You take Kaf, meaning the palm of the hand. Draw a little open hand. It means K for ayin, a Semitic throat sound we do not really have in English. You take the word ayin, which means eye. Draw a little eye. It means that sound. You can see how simple this system was, and how brilliant, because it meant that anyone who could speak Canaanite could, at least in principle, work out for themselves what each sign meant. If you saw a little house picture and knew that houses were called Beit, well, Beit starts with B, so the sign must mean B. The whole system was self-teaching. It was mnemonic. It carried its own instruction manual embedded inside itself, right there in the shape of each sign. You did not need years and years of scribal school to learn it. You just needed to be able to speak your own language and recognize a few pictures. A bright child could pick it up in an afternoon. And most brilliantly of all, and this is the part that would eventually change the world, this new system had only about 22 to 28 signs total. Not 700, not 600, not 200, somewhere in the low 20s. That's it. That is a small enough number that a human brain can hold every single sign in memory at once, without any strain, and without needing to constantly refer back to a reference chart. It is the smallest number of signs that a writing system has ever gotten down to and still remained fully functional. And it turned out to be the right number, the exactly right number. Somewhere between 20 and 30 signs seems to be a sweet spot for the human mind. Small enough to memorize completely, yet large enough to capture all the essential sounds of a spoken language. Every alphabetic writing system that has ever existed, in every language, in every part of the world, has ended up hovering in roughly that same range. 22 Phoenician letters, 24 Greek letters, 26 English letters, 28 Arabic letters, 29 Old Persian cuneiform letters. Whichever direction you look, you keep landing in that same narrow band. As if the human brain had run some enormous, unconscious optimization problem across 4,000 years of experimentation and settled, more or less, on the same answer everywhere. Give me about 20-something signs, not fewer, or I cannot say enough, not more, or I cannot remember them all. And to think that this whole enormous discovery, this cognitive shortcut that would eventually put reading and writing into the hands of ordinary people across the entire globe, began as a rough, workmanlike shortcut invented by turquoise miners in a scorched corner of the Sinai Desert around 1800 BC. It really is a wonderful thing to sit with for a moment. Because when we usually imagine the great inventions of the ancient world, we imagine them coming out of palaces or temples or great schools of philosophy. We imagine wise men in robes stroking their beards and having brilliant insights. But this one, the invention of the alphabet, appears to have come out of a mine. Out of a group of dirty, exhausted, dusty laborers who wanted to be able to leave a little scratched message on a rock without needing a 15-year scribal education to do it. The alphabet is, at its deepest root, a worker's invention, a shortcut for the shortcuts. We call this earliest form of the alphabet Proto-Sinaitic because the first examples of it were found in the Sinai Peninsula. Or sometimes Proto-Canaanite, because we now know it was also being used up in Canaan itself around roughly the same time. Scholars still argue about the exact details of where and when it first appeared. Some researchers push the date a bit earlier, some a bit later. Some think it started in Egypt proper and then spread to Sinai. Some think it started in the Levant and spread down into Sinai. The evidence is fragmentary and difficult to interpret because, well, this was a system used by people who did not really leave grand monuments. They scratched things onto rocks and pottery fragments and small offerings. Working-class writing, casual writing, the kind of writing that does not usually survive very well for 4,000 years. But we do have some inscriptions, a handful really, little scratchy things on stone, most of them barely legible. One of the most famous is a small sphinx statue found at Serabit El Khadim itself, with a short inscription running down one side. When scholars finally decoded it in the early 20th century, it turned out to say something like, "Beloved of the goddess Baalat," or possibly, "For the lady," depending on how you read it. Baalat was a Canaanite goddess, essentially a Semitic equivalent of the Egyptian Hathor to whom the local shrine was dedicated. So here we have a Canaanite worker up in the mountains of Sinai, making a little offering to a local version of a goddess, and using a new writing system that they or someone very much like them had just invented to dedicate that offering in their own language, in signs that they could actually read. It is a small thing, but it is, in its quiet way, one of the most important little pieces of stone in the entire history of human communication. Now, one of the loveliest things about these very early alphabet signs, and this is the point I really want you to hold on to tonight, is that every single one of them is a little picture. Every single one. Every letter in that early alphabet is a fossilized image of something the Canaanite workers saw around them in their daily lives. A house, water, a snake, a hand, an eye, an ox's head, a fish, a door, a tent peg, a palm frond, a monkey. A cross-shaped mark, possibly meaning a signature or a symbol. Every letter is a tiny window into the visual world of Bronze Age Canaanite laborers, 3,800 years ago. Whenever you write a letter today, in English, or Spanish, or Russian, or Greek, or Arabic, or Hebrew, you are drawing, in an incredibly abstract and stylized form, a picture that started out as something in the daily life of some anonymous ancient worker. That is one of the most beautiful facts I know, and most people go their entire lives without ever hearing it. So now let's follow the alphabet as it makes its slow journey out of the Sinai and into the rest of the ancient world. Because for the first few centuries after its invention, this new script does not really seem to have caught on all that much. It was a rough, informal system used by ordinary people scratching notes on rocks. The great powers of the day, Egypt and Mesopotamia, and the various Bronze Age kingdoms in between, all continued to use their own established writing systems for official business. Hieroglyphs kept marching across the walls of Egyptian temples. Cuneiform kept accumulating on tablets across Mesopotamia and Syria and Anatolia. The alphabet, meanwhile, was a curiosity, a shortcut. Something used by working people to write their names on their tools, or to leave little messages for each other, or to make small dedications at local shrines. But then, around the year 1200 BC, the Bronze Age world experienced one of the strangest and most poorly understood catastrophes in all of history. Something we now call, rather dramatically, the Bronze Age collapse. Within the space of about 50 years, one great civilization after another crumbled. The Hittite Empire in what is now Turkey collapsed. The mighty city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast burned. The great Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed. Egypt was attacked repeatedly by mysterious raiders remembered only as the Sea Peoples, and though it survived, was seriously weakened. Trade networks broke down. Populations fell. Writing systems, in some regions, simply disappeared. Mycenaean Greek writing, called Linear vanished so completely that the Greeks would essentially forget how to write for the next 400 years. Nobody entirely knows why this collapse happened. There are dozens of theories. Climate change and prolonged drought, migrations of new peoples pushing down from the north, internal social unrest, earthquakes, plague, disruptions to the sophisticated bronze trade that made all the major weapons of the era. Probably it was some combination of all of the above, a cascade of interlocking crises that pulled the whole interconnected Bronze Age world down together. The result was a kind of dark age across much of the eastern Mediterranean. And when the dust finally began to settle in the centuries that followed, the world that emerged looked rather different from the world that had been. Along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, in the narrow strip of land between the mountains of Lebanon and the sea, a group of coastal cities had managed to survive the collapse reasonably intact. Their names were Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and Arwad, among others. Their inhabitants spoke a Semitic language closely related to the language of the old Canaanite miners in Sinai. They had inherited the alphabet from their ancestors. And in the centuries after the collapse, as the old great powers were preoccupied with rebuilding themselves, these coastal city-states discovered that they had a very valuable niche to fill. They became traders, seafarers, the middlemen of the Mediterranean. We call these people the Phoenicians, though they never called themselves that. Phoenicians is a name given to them by the later Greeks, deriving from a Greek word for a purple dye that these coastal cities were famous for producing from a specific kind of sea snail. To themselves, they were simply Canaanites or citizens of their own particular cities. But Phoenician is the name history remembers them by, so Phoenician we will call them. The Phoenicians, over the course of roughly the 11th through the 8th centuries BC, built up an extraordinary trading network that stretched all across the Mediterranean and even beyond it. They sailed to Cyprus for copper. They sailed to Sardinia and Sicily. They sailed to Spain to trade for silver at a place called Tartessus. They founded colonies along the coast of North Africa, the most famous of which was Carthage, which would eventually rival Rome itself. They may even have sailed out through the Strait of Gibraltar, up the Atlantic coast to Britain in search of tin, or down along the West African coast, though the details of these voyages are lost to us. Wherever they went, they set up small trading posts, warehouses, wharves. Wherever they went, they carried their goods. And wherever they went, they carried their alphabet. Because now, at long last, the alphabet came into its true element. A trader, unlike a temple accountant or a royal scribe, does not have 15 years to spend in scribal school. A trader needs to be able to jot down a quick note about a shipment, sign a contract with a foreign counterparty, keep a running tally of debts and credits, and do it all fast, often in a hurry, often at a dock or on the deck of a ship. A trader needs a writing system that is portable, learnable in a matter of weeks, and flexible enough to handle multiple languages if necessary. And that is exactly what the Phoenician alphabet was. 22 little signs, each standing for a consonant sound of the Phoenician language, and each of them a slightly stylized descendant of those old pictographic Canaanite letters. The house, the water, the snake, the ox's head, the palm of the hand, all still there, but simpler now, cleaner, faster to write. And the Phoenicians, being pragmatic business people, did not treat their alphabet as a sacred secret. They did not guard it jealously as the Egyptian and Mesopotamian scribes had guarded their systems. Quite the contrary. Wherever the Phoenicians did business, they were happy to let their trading partners see how their writing worked. And when those trading partners started to think, this looks like a very handy little system, could we perhaps use this for our own language too? The Phoenicians, as far as we can tell, said, sure, why not? Take it, use it, adapt it. It's just business. And over the course of a few centuries, that is exactly what happened. All around the Mediterranean, one people after another looked at the Phoenician alphabet, said, yes, we can work with this, and adapted it to their own language. The Arameans, up in Syria, took the Phoenician letters and used them to write Aramaic, which would eventually become one of the great international languages of the Near East. The Hebrews took the Phoenician letters and used them to write Hebrew, and eventually the Hebrew Bible would be recorded in that script. The Hebrews took the Phoenician letters and used them to write Hebrew, and eventually the Hebrew Bible would be recorded in that script, though in a somewhat evolved form of it. The Nabateans, a desert trading people down in what is now Jordan, took the alphabet and gave rise to a script that would eventually become the Arabic alphabet we know today. The Aramaic alphabet itself would eventually travel eastward and become the ancestor of the scripts used to write Persian, Syriac, and even, some scholars believe, ultimately the scripts of India and Southeast Asia. Wherever the alphabet went, it multiplied and evolved and blossomed into new local varieties, each adapted to the particular sounds of the language it was being used for. But underneath all these different forms, if you look carefully enough, you can still see the ghosts of those original Canaanite pictures. The house is still there in every one of them. The water is still there. The ox's head is still there, though sometimes lying on its side, sometimes flipped upside down, sometimes stretched or squashed almost beyond recognition. But of all the peoples who borrowed the Phoenician alphabet, one in particular is going to matter to us tonight, because they are the ones who are going to give us the letters that eventually make it onto your screen and into your books. And those people are the Greeks. Now, the Greeks, remember, had entered a kind of dark age after the collapse of the Mycenaean palaces around 1200 BC. Their old writing system, Linear B, was forgotten. For about 400 years, Greek was a language that could be spoken but not written. Homer, if there really was such a person as Homer, composed his great epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, entirely in an oral tradition, memorized and passed down from one generation of bards to the next without ever being written down. It is only later, once the Greeks had learned to write again, that these poems were finally committed to permanent form. And how did the Greeks learn to write again? By meeting the Phoenicians. The exact date and place of this borrowing is still disputed. Some scholars think it happened as early as the 11th century BC. Others think it happened as late as the 8th century BC. Some think it happened on the island of Cyprus, where Greeks and Phoenicians had been trading and living side by side for a long time. Others think it happened on the island of Crete, or on the shores of what is now Syria, or in the Aegean itself. But at some point, in some place, a Greek looked at what the Phoenicians were doing with their little alphabet, decided it was a really rather good idea, and set about adapting it for the Greek language. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, remembered a tradition that the alphabet had been brought to Greece by a legendary Phoenician prince named Cadmus, who founded the city of Thebes and taught the Greeks how to write. Herodotus even called the letters Phoenician letters, in Greek, Phoenicia grammata, well into his own time. So the Greeks themselves never forgot where their alphabet had come from. They knew it was a Phoenician import. They just improved upon it. And what an improvement it was, because the Greeks did something with the alphabet that nobody had ever done before. They added vowels. This might sound like a small thing. It is not. It is one of the most important refinements in the entire history of writing. Every alphabetic writing system before the Greek one, all the way back to those Canaanite miners in Sinai, had recorded only consonants. The Phoenicians wrote consonants. The Hebrews wrote consonants. The Arameans wrote consonants. If you were reading a Phoenician text and you came across the sequence of letters BT, you had to figure out from context whether the word meant bit, bet, bat, boat, beat, bite, bout, or something else entirely. In practice, for a native speaker of the language, this was not usually a big problem in the way that a modern texter reading, be there in 5, has no real trouble filling in the missing vowels. Context does most of the work. But it did mean that consonant-only writing was harder to learn, harder to read, and much harder to use for representing a language you did not already speak fluently. The Greek language, unlike the Semitic languages, was full of vowels doing important work. Greek vowels were not just decorations. They were the difference between one word and another, between one grammatical form and another. So the Greeks looked at the Phoenician alphabet and thought, this is lovely, but we need some way to write down our vowels, and their solution was elegant. They took a small number of Phoenician letters that stood for consonant sounds Greek did not really use or did not need distinct signs for, and repurposed those letters as vowel signs. Take the very first letter of the Phoenician alphabet, for instance. It was called Aleph, and it was a stylized picture of an ox's head. Just a simple little triangle with 2 lines poking up from it, representing the horns. In Phoenician, Aleph stood for a soft glottal stop, a little catch of the throat that Greek did not have as a distinct sound. So the Greeks took Aleph and said, we do not need this for a consonant, we will use it for the vowel sound. They called it alpha. And the little ox's head, over centuries of stylization, eventually got tipped on its side, then flipped upside down, so that the horns pointed downward and the pointed muzzle pointed upward. Which is why, when you write a capital A today, you are drawing, in a very stylized and inverted form, the head of an ox that some ancient Canaanite worker drew right side up nearly 4,000 years ago. I really want you to sit with that for a moment. The letter A that you learned first, when you were a small child sitting in a classroom or on your parents' lap, with those 2 slanting lines and the crossbar in the middle, is an upside-down ox's head. That is what the shape is. Those 2 slanting lines are the horns, pointing downward now instead of upward. That crossbar is the muzzle or the forehead. The whole letter is a fossil, a preserved little picture, still faithfully drawn every single time you sign your name or type a text message. Every time you write an A, you are drawing a cow. You just do not know that you are, and now you know. And this is true for pretty much every letter you use. Let me walk you through a few more. The letter B in Phoenician, it was called Bet, meaning house, a little rectangle with a doorway. Over time, the Greeks and later borrowers stylized it into the 2 loops we know today, but it is still, in its bones, a house picture. Every time you write a B, you are drawing a house. The letter D in Phoenician, it was called Dalet, which is the word for door, a little triangle representing the flap of a tent or the panel of a doorway, stylized over centuries into the semicircle we use today. Every D is a door. The letter M, remember, in Phoenician it was called Mem, from the Semitic word for water, mayim, a wavy line like ripples. The Greeks tidied it up into a zigzag. Later scribes standardized the zigzag into the 4 strokes of the M we now use. Every M is water. The letter N in Phoenician it was called nun, meaning fish. A wavy line with a little hook at one end, meant to suggest a fish's shape. Over time, this evolved into our familiar and every N is a fish. The letter O in Phoenician it was called ayin, meaning eye. A little circle, or sometimes a circle with a dot in the middle, like a pupil inside an iris. The Greeks kept it as a simple circle and called it a micron, which literally means small o. Every O you write is an eye, staring back at you from the page. The letter P in Phoenician it was called P, meaning mouth. A shape sort of like an open mouth in profile. This eventually became our P. Every P is a mouth. The letter Q in Phoenician it was called Kaf, and there is some debate about what it originally represented. Possibly a monkey, possibly the eye of a needle, possibly a knot. Whatever it was, its distinctive circle with a tail shape has survived, essentially unchanged, for nearly 4,000 years. The letter R in Phoenician it was called Resh, meaning head. A stylized profile of a human head with a little bump at the top. Over centuries, that bump became the loop of our modern R, and a leg was added at the bottom in the Roman period. Every R is a head in profile. The letter T in Phoenician it was called Tor, which meant a mark or a signature. Originally it was drawn as a simple X shape or a cross. That is where the shape of the letter T ultimately comes from, though the exact form has shifted over time. You could go through pretty much the entire alphabet like this, letter by letter, and behind almost every one of them you will find a little Canaanite picture. A tent peg, a palm frond, the palm of a hand, a camel maybe, a weapon, little scraps of Bronze Age life, quietly hidden in plain sight, right there in the words you write every single day. Now, the Greeks did not just add vowels to the Phoenician alphabet. They also did something else that turned out to be very significant. They changed the direction of writing. The Phoenicians, like all their Semitic cousins, wrote from right to left, which is, if you think about it, actually quite a natural way to write if you are working with a stylus or a chisel and holding it in your right hand, since you can see the marks you are making without your hand covering them up. The early Greeks initially wrote right to left as well, imitating their Phoenician teachers. But then, for a while, they went through a period of something called Boustrophedon writing, which is a wonderful Greek word meaning, as the ox plows. In Boustrophedon, you write one line from right to left. Then when you reach the end of that line, you turn around and write the next line from left to right. Then turn around again for the next line, snaking back and forth across the page like a farmer plowing a field. Snaking back and forth across the page like a farmer plowing a field. And when the Greeks were writing in Boustrophedon style, they would actually flip each letter around to face the direction of the writing, so that letters on right to left lines faced right, and letters on left to right lines faced left. This was very sensible if slightly dizzying to modern eyes. But eventually, over a period of a couple of centuries, the Greeks decided to standardize the whole business, and they settled on left to right as the direction of writing. And left to right, it has been for Greek, and for Latin, and for all the European languages descended from them ever since. If you have ever wondered why English is written left to right, while Arabic and Hebrew are written right to left, well, that split goes all the way back to this particular Greek decision, made somewhere around the 7th or 6th century BC, on an island in the Aegean, by people whose names we do not know, for reasons we can only partly reconstruct. Once the Greeks had their alphabet, with its added vowels and its settled left-to-right direction, they went about doing something with it that no ancient people had ever really done before. They began, gradually, to democratize writing. Not fully, of course. Full literacy in the sense we would recognize today was still centuries away. But in Greece, writing began to escape from the exclusive control of a professional scribal class. Ordinary citizens could learn the alphabet. Merchants could keep their own accounts without needing to hire a scribe. Poets could write their own verses. Politicians could draft their own speeches. And philosophers, wonderfully, could put down their arguments on papyrus, send them to distant colleagues, and receive written responses back. The whole ecosystem of literate exchange that we associate with classical Greek civilization, the plays of Sophocles, The histories of Herodotus, the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, the mathematics of Euclid, the medicine of Hippocrates, all of this becomes possible precisely because writing has been simplified to the point where any reasonably educated person can use it. The alphabet, in a sense, is what makes ancient Greece, in the way we remember it. Without those 24 little letters, so much of what we think of as the foundation of Western intellectual life would simply never have existed in the form that it did. And once the Greek alphabet was up and running, it began, in its turn, to spread. Because the Greeks, like the Phoenicians before them, were traders and colonists, and they carried their culture wherever they went. All around the Mediterranean in the 8th and 7th and 6th centuries BC, Greek colonies were being founded, along the coasts of what is now Turkey, around the Black Sea, in Sicily and southern Italy, a region so full of Greek colonies that the Romans later called it Magna Graecia, or Great Greece, along the southern coast of France, even into Spain. Everywhere the Greeks went, they took their alphabet with them. And in Italy, around the 8th century BC, one particular group of people took a very close look at the Greek alphabet and decided that they, too, would like to have such a thing for their own language. These people were called the Etruscans. They lived in what is now Tuscany, roughly, and they were a fascinating and mysterious civilization whose language we still cannot fully read, even today. The Etruscans borrowed the Greek alphabet, adapted it to fit the sounds of their own language, tweaked some of the letter shapes to suit their own aesthetic preferences, and used it happily for several centuries. And then, just south of the Etruscans, another group of people took a close look at what the Etruscans were doing, and these people were called the Romans. And when the Romans borrowed the alphabet from the Etruscans in around the 7th century BC, they set in motion the final major transformation that would give us the letters you are looking at right now. Because the Romans were, in their own peculiar way, absolute geniuses at practical adaptation. They took the Etruscan letters, which the Etruscans had themselves taken from the Greeks, and they polished them. They simplified them. They standardized their shapes. They dropped a few letters that they did not need for Latin. They added a few new ones. And most importantly, they carved these letters over the centuries into the sides of thousands upon thousands of monuments, triumphal arches, column bases, milestones, tombstones, public buildings. The letter shapes we now think of as the capital letters of the alphabet, those perfectly proportioned Roman capitals with their elegant serifs and their careful balance of thick and thin strokes, were essentially standardized by Roman stone carvers between roughly the 1st century BC and the 2nd century AD. The classical example of this is the inscription on the base of Trajan's column in Rome, carved around 113 AD, whose letter forms are considered so perfect that they were still being used as a model by typographers and calligraphers well into the 20th century. Modern typefaces are still, in many cases, distantly descended from those Roman stone-cut capitals. When you look at a well-designed capital A or B or R in a book today, you are essentially looking at an echo of what some Roman stonecutter was doing 2,000 years ago. The Romans also, over time, developed cursive and lower-case forms of their letters, because for everyday writing on wax tablets or on papyrus, the elegant stone-cut capitals were too slow and too formal. So a whole family of cursive scripts developed, evolved, split into regional variants, got standardized, and eventually settled into the small letters of the alphabet we now use. The lowercase, are you right today, with its little belly and its tail, is a distant descendant of a Roman cursive form. The two-part shape of the modern G, with its top loop and its bottom loop, is another survival from medieval scribal handwriting. Every letter has this long, slow history of gradual transformation, of forms flowing into other forms, of habits of hand and eye slowly reshaping the marks on the page over century after century. And then, in the 15th century AD, Johannes Gutenberg came along in the German city of Mainz and did something that changed the letters forever. He worked out how to make movable metal type and how to press inked letters onto paper in a mechanical press. This meant that the shapes of the letters, which had been fluid and evolving for thousands of years, suddenly became fixed. Once a punch cutter had carved a particular letter shape into steel, that shape could be reproduced identically thousands upon thousands of times. The early printers modeled their type on the best contemporary handwriting they could find, which in Gutenberg's case was the elegant Gothic script of German monastic scribes. But very quickly, in Italy, printers began cutting type based on the elegant humanist handwriting of Renaissance scholars, which itself was based on the beautiful Carolingian scripts of the 9th century, which had themselves been based on late Roman book hands, which had descended in a long line from those stone-cut Roman capitals. And the loveliest thing is that when you strip away all these layers of historical influence and look at the underlying skeleton of the letters, what you find is still, ultimately, that same little collection of Canaanite pictures. The ox head, the house, the water, the eye, the fish, the mouth, still there, still faithful, still doing their job 4,000 years later. Now, I want to bring us back for a moment to something that I mentioned right at the beginning of this whole story tonight, because it is worth revisiting now that we have come so far. Do you remember, right near the very start, I said that when you find one of those little clay tokens in the ground, you probably would not think much of it and might toss it into a flower pot without a second thought. Well, imagine now if you had been walking through the ruins of Uruk 5,000 years ago and you had seen those first accountants pressing their signs into wet clay, and someone had come up to you and said, "Do you know what those people over there are doing? They are inventing something that is going to change the entire course of the human species." Everything from religion to law, to science to poetry to democracy, to modern medicine, to the message you are going to send your grandchildren next week, all of it is going to trace itself back, in a chain of small careful steps, to what those little accountants are doing right there with their bits of clay. You would probably have thought that person was mad. You would probably have shaken your head and walked on. Because it does not look like much, does it, the moment when everything begins? That is one of the things that history teaches us again and again. The greatest revolutions almost never look like revolutions at the time. They look like small, practical adjustments made by tired people trying to solve small, practical problems. Someone in Uruk noticing that they did not need the tokens anymore. Someone in Sinai noticing that they did not need 700 hieroglyphs. Someone in Greece noticing that vowels might be worth writing down. Someone in Rome deciding that this particular shape of the letter A looked a bit tidier than that one. Little decisions, little tweaks, little shortcuts, made by people who almost certainly had no idea that they were reshaping the future. But those little decisions accumulated, one on top of another, across 5,000 years. And that is the thing about writing. It has this quiet, patient, cumulative quality to it. Every time somebody makes a mark on a page, they are drawing on a technology that was refined by every literate person who came before them. Every book you have ever read, every letter you have ever received, every message on your phone, every sign on the side of the road, every label on a can of beans, every whisper of ink or pixel of light, all of it is riding on the back of 4,000 years of small human ingenuity. It is one of the most extraordinary inheritances that any of us receives, and one that most of us barely think about at all. We just, well, read. We just write. We just take it for granted, as if letters had always existed, as if they had fallen from the sky, as if the alphabet had been given to us fully formed by some benevolent god. But it was not given to us. It was made. Slowly, patiently, imperfectly, by many, many hands. Cushim's hands. Enheduanna's hands. The unnamed hands of those turquoise miners in Sinai. The hands of Phoenician sailors and Greek philosophers and Roman stonecutters and medieval monks and Renaissance printers. The hands of Phoenician sailors and Greek philosophers and Roman stonecutters and medieval monks and Renaissance printers. And countless others in between whose names we will never know, whose faces we will never see, whose small daily decisions accumulated over generations into the extraordinary gift that each of us now carries around in our heads and in our hands without ever really pausing to marvel at it. Now, before we start winding down for the night, I want to circle back to some of the specific characters and moments we have met along the way, because part of what makes this story so lovely is that the same little threads keep weaving themselves back through history in unexpected ways. Let's go back, for instance, to Cushim, our accountant in the Uruk temple, roughly 5,200 years ago. When Cushim finished his day's work and went home, he almost certainly did not think of himself as historically important. He was doing his job, just as you might, at the end of a long day at the office, finish up your last email and shut down your computer and think about what to make for dinner. Cushim probably ate his own dinner that evening, probably sat with his family if he had one, probably talked about ordinary things, probably slept. Probably got up the next morning and went back to the temple and counted more sacks of barley. And so on, day after day, for years, until at some point he became too old or too ill or too dead to keep counting. And then someone else took over his job, and Cushim was forgotten. Or would have been forgotten, except that his name, those two little wedge marks at the bottom of a routine barley ledger, happened to survive. There is something almost unbearably poignant about that, I think, because it makes you wonder how many other Cushims there were, how many other bookkeepers and shepherds and weavers and bakers and midwives and washwomen and children and grandmothers whose names got scratched onto tablets that did not happen to survive. Millions upon millions of ancient lives, each one just as vivid and full and complicated as your own life feels right now from the inside. Almost all of them gone without a trace. And Cushim, by pure chance, made it through. His name is one of the very, very few that did, which means, in a small way, he is standing in for all of them. When we say his name aloud in the dark, we are also saluting all the others whose names we cannot say because we do not know them. All those anonymous ancient humans who worked and loved and worried and died, and whose voices we would give almost anything to hear and never can. Cushim, in that sense, is the honorary spokesman of the great silent multitude of the past, speaking for all of them from underneath his little pile of 5,000-year-old barley receipts. And then there is Enheduanna, a high priestess at Ur, 4,300 years ago. Sometimes I try to imagine what it must have been like for her on the day she was driven from her temple by that rebel leader Lugalan. All the years she had spent, standing in her elaborate robes on the temple platform, presiding over ceremonies, receiving offerings, being addressed as the daughter of the great king, being treated as almost a living link between the gods and the people. And then, suddenly, all of that stripped away, chased out of her home, forced to hide, reduced to writing furious, sorrowful hymns in the dark, begging Inanna for justice. And you know, in that hymn, the exaltation of Inanna, there is a moment where she talks about the goddess restoring her to her rightful place, and you can practically hear the tears of relief in the lines. It is not just a formal ritual poem. It is a personal survival document. It is a woman reaching out into the darkness and finding that her words, her carefully chosen Sumerian words pressed into wet clay, actually might have the power to save her. And that discovery, that words might have power, is really the birth of the whole idea of literature as we understand it. Not just record keeping, not just contracts, but writing as a way of making meaning. Writing as a way of asserting oneself against the chaos of the world. Writing as a way of being heard. I like to think that Enheduanna knew, in some deep part of herself, that what she was doing was new. That her signing of her name at the end of her hymns was not just a formality but a claim on posterity, a quiet insistence that this priestess, this woman, this person had existed and had made something. And she was right. She had made something. And here we are, more than 4,000 years later, in the middle of the night, still saying her name. She got what she was asking for in the end, just took a little longer than she probably would have hoped. And then there are those turquoise miners, the ones we have really no personal information about at all. No names, no signatures, no portraits, no biographies, just a scatter of rough little inscriptions carved into rocks in the middle of the Sinai Desert at a place most modern people have never even heard of. But those anonymous workers gave us the alphabet, every letter you have ever read, every book on your shelf, every poem you have ever loved, every scientific paper, every love letter, every diary, every text message, every note tucked into a lunchbox, all of it ultimately tracing back to them, and they never knew. They never knew what they were doing. They were just trying to leave a mark on a rock. They probably thought, if they thought about it at all, that their little scratchings would be forgotten within a generation. And instead, 4,000 years later, we are still using their invention, and it is one of the most successful ideas in the history of the human species. The lesson there, I think, is that you never really know which of your small daily actions is going to turn out to matter enormously. So it is probably worth doing them all with a little bit of care, just in case. Now, one lovely little detail I want to add before we move to the closing of the video. Every letter, as we have talked about, is a fossilized picture. And when you know what each letter originally represented, you can look at any written word and see, in a sense, a little animated cartoon playing out across the page. Let me demonstrate. Take the English word boat. 4 letters. B-O-A-T in the language of the original pictures that spells house, ox mark. So the word boat is, secretly, a tiny hidden sentence about a house watching an ox making a mark. Which is, obviously, complete nonsense. But it is a wonderful kind of nonsense, because every single word you read, in a very real sense, is a small hidden procession of Bronze Age images that no longer mean what they used to mean, but are still there, still holding their old shapes, still faithfully turning up whenever they are called upon. Every page of every book you have ever read has been a quiet parade of ancient pictures, marching along beneath the surface of the letters, doing their work in disguise. It is one of the loveliest secrets that hides in plain sight in the world we live in. Now, of course, I would be doing you a disservice tonight if I did not point out that the story of writing did not stop with the Romans, or with Gutenberg, or with any single moment. It has continued to evolve, right up to the present day. The letters themselves have stayed remarkably stable once they were nailed down by printing, but the ways in which we use them have kept transforming. In the 19th century, mass literacy finally became a reality across much of the world, thanks to public education. For the first time in human history, the majority of people in many countries could actually read and write. Newspapers exploded. Cheap books became available. Ordinary people could send letters to each other by post. It was a democratization of the written word on a scale that Cushim and Enheduanna and those turquoise miners could never have imagined. In the 20th century, the typewriter put the ability to produce clean, standardized text into the hands of secretaries and journalists and novelists. Then the personal computer put it into the hands of pretty much everybody. And then the internet made it possible for any person, anywhere in the world, to broadcast their words to any other person, anywhere else in the world, essentially instantly and essentially for free. It is easy, when you use these technologies every day, to forget how astonishing they are. Cushim's little clay tablets, carried by hand from one office to another, took hours or days to travel from writer to reader. A modern text message travels the same distance in a fraction of a second, and you can send one to someone on the other side of the planet just as easily as to someone in the next room. The physical constraints on writing, which shaped the whole first 4,000 years of the story we have been telling, have almost entirely dissolved. But underneath all of this, the technology of the letters themselves, those stubborn little pictorial descendants of Canaanite oxen and houses and eyes and mouths, has remained more or less the same. When you type an email today, you are still, in your bones, doing what those miners in Sinai were doing when they scratched their offerings to Baalat into the rock. You are choosing signs. You are arranging them in order. You are trusting that another human being, somewhere else in space and time, will look at your marks and reconstruct in their own head the sounds and meanings that were in yours. It is really one of the most extraordinary things that our species has ever learned how to do, and we do it so casually now that we barely notice. There is a beautiful thought that has been articulated by various writers in different forms over the years, and I want to share a version of it with you tonight. The alphabet is, in a certain sense, humanity's greatest ghost story. Every letter is a tiny, patient ghost, a little picture that lost its original meaning thousands of years ago, but that has been so faithful, so uncomplaining, so willing to keep doing its job, that we still call on it every day without ever thanking it, without ever noticing it, without ever really knowing what it once was. 26 little ghosts in English, 24 in Greek, 22 in Hebrew. Each one carrying, deep inside itself, the memory of some object that some ancient person once looked at and cared enough about to turn into a sign. Every time you write a word, you are conjuring up a little procession of ghosts and putting them to work. Every time you write a word, you are conjuring up a little procession of ghosts and putting them to work. And they, without complaint, do the work. They carry your meaning across the room, across the country, across the world, across time. They will still be doing it long after you and I are gone. Some Kushim of the future, some Enheduanna of the future, will pick up these same little ghosts and press them into service for their own purposes, and never really think about it very much either. That is how it goes. That is how it has always gone. That is how, one hopes, it will continue to go, for as long as human beings have anything left to say to one another. Before we drift off entirely for the evening, let me share one more small thought about all of this, because I think there is something quietly beautiful about the fact that writing began as such a modest, practical, unromantic thing. Not with poetry, not with prayer, not with grand declarations from kings, but with a slightly harried accountant in Uruk, trying to keep track of who owed how much beer to whom. There is a kind of humility built into the origin of writing that I find deeply reassuring, because it reminds us that the most important things we have ever invented did not spring fully formed from the minds of geniuses. They came out of ordinary people, doing ordinary work, in ordinary places, one small day at a time. Kushim was not trying to change the world. He was trying to close out his ledger before he went home for dinner, but because he did his job carefully, and because he happened to sign his name, and because his little tablet happened to survive when so many others did not, he became the first individual human being whose name we know. Which is, I think, a lovely lesson for all of us to carry into our own lives. Do your work carefully, sign your name where you can, and let the centuries decide what they want to do with it. You will not be around to see the result, but something of you might, unexpectedly, endure. And even if nothing endures, the work itself will have been worth doing, because that is how the whole enormous edifice of human civilization has been built. One careful accountant, one devoted priestess, one anonymous laborer with a chisel and an idea, one patient monk copying a manuscript in a candlelit scriptorium, one printer setting type in a workshop in Mainz, one typist pounding out a report on a Remington in 1912, one student, sometime in the 21st century, listening to a long, quiet story about the history of writing while drifting off to sleep with a cup of tea gone cold on the nightstand. All of us together, keeping the little ghosts of the alphabet alive by using them, passing them forward, trusting that the next generation will pick them up and carry them a bit further still. And that, really, is where our story ends tonight. Not with a dramatic climax, not with a great battle or a great triumph, just with a soft acknowledgement that the letters on your screen, the letters in your books, the letters you have known since you were small, are older than any king, older than any empire, older than any religion still being practiced today. They are older than Rome, older than Athens, older than Jerusalem, older than Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam combined. They have watched entire civilizations rise and fall and rise again, and they will, in all likelihood, outlast us too. Little patient ghosts, doing their quiet work, still on duty, still on the page. All right, we are at the end of the video, and here we are again at that lovely, quiet moment when I get to thank the people who make all of this possible. So let me thank our top-tier supporters tonight. We have got Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Amber, Susan, Cameron, Gary, Charlene, Lindy, Reese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulf, Fidney, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neurona, Aaron, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Jill, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stephen, Kevin, HMSH, Crystal, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Google Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Nefties, Alexander, Gog and Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Corsi, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mocha, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian. Are You My Mom, Rhonda, Carrie, Katie B, Lovely, Boma, Gavin, Marissa, Alderzakin, Lucy, Julian, Rosie, D. Below, Chris, Apocalyptic, Randy, Wolfsbane, Jude, Brinny, Aiden, Fabian, Michael, Agworm, Prince of Persia, River, Indian Trail, Catherine, Alexa, Big Gun 101, Randy, Bestie Hunt, Stevie, Jessica, Scott, Gail, Emily, Jade, Jake, Demonstow, Mason, John, Magenta, Dumpster, Tracy, Mossy Frog, Catherine, Ezio Audit, Autumn, Monica, Jennifer, White Rags, Gertrude, Rose, Fallen Horse, Sandpiper, Mike, Darth Milo, Daryl, Michelle, Ezio, Melissa, Joy, Jennifer, and Lindsay. Thank you all so much. Your quiet, faithful support is what makes it possible for this channel to keep running completely ad-free. No interruptions, no mattress salesmen, no 15-second jump scares in the middle of a lovely, calm story. Just uninterrupted narrative from beginning to end. And that is, honestly, a rare thing in the modern media landscape. So thank you for helping to keep this little space peaceful. And to everyone else listening tonight, thank you too. Thank you for coming along on this long journey with me, from the sun-baked temple offices of Uruk, to the priestly chambers of Ur, to the turquoise mines of Sinai, to the trading ports of Phoenicia, to the philosophical schools of Athens, to the stone-cut monuments of Rome, and finally back to wherever you happen to be right now. Wherever that is, whatever it looks like, whether you are curled up in bed or sitting in a quiet room or lying on a couch with the lights turned low, I hope you have felt a little bit of the wonder of this story. I hope, when you next pick up a pen or type a message or open a book, that you will pause for just a fraction of a second and remember Kushum, remember Enheduanna. Remember the ox head hidden inside every letter A. Remember the house hidden inside every letter B. Remember the I hidden inside every letter O, looking back at you from the page, quietly, patiently, faithfully, as it has done for thousands of years. If you liked this video, do leave a like, a comment, and consider subscribing. It genuinely does help the channel enormously. Tell me in the comments where you were listening from tonight. Tell me if you have ever tried to learn one of these old scripts. Tell me if you have a favorite letter of the alphabet, and now, knowing where it came from, whether you feel any differently about it. I do read the comments, even if I cannot always reply to all of them, and it is one of the loveliest parts of running this channel to hear from the people who spend their evenings drifting off to these stories. What? You did not fall asleep now, did you? It is okay if you did. That is really the point of all this. Do whatever makes you feel comfortable. Stretch if you need to. Turn off the light if it is still on. Roll over. Pull the blanket a little higher. Take a slow, deep breath in through the nose and let it out slowly through the mouth. Let the day go. Let all the little worries loosen their grip on you for a while. Everything that you were fretting about at some point today, well, it will still be there in the morning and you will handle it then. Right now, you can rest. As for me, I am done with my work for the evening as well. I think I am going to pour myself a cup of something warm and settle into a chair by the window and maybe pick up a book. I have not quite decided what book yet. There is that C.L. Werner Warhammer novel that I have been picking at, and there is a lovely history of medieval scriptoria sitting on the stack beside my chair that I have been meaning to get further into. Or maybe I will just sit and think for a while and let the story we have told tonight settle into the quiet corners of my mind. There is something particularly nice, I find, about ending an evening after having told a story about the origins of writing. It makes me want to reach for something written. It makes me feel grateful, in a small way, for every book that has ever been made, and for every ancient hand that made all of it possible. Good night, everyone. Sleep well. Dream of little clay tablets, if you like, or of turquoise miners in the desert, or of priestesses composing hymns by lamplight, or of anything at all that pleases you.